Okay, so for benefit of the recording, yes, this is an official CNCF meeting. This is the AI Gateway Working Group meeting. Since it is an official CNCF meeting, you need to abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, which boils down to be nice and don't be horrible. Um, Apparently, I've been made host as well, but this is being recorded, so remember, this is for posterity. We have an agenda. I'm going to repaste the link to the agenda because I know Zoom can be a little bit weird, just in case somebody couldn't see it before. At present, there is literally nothing on the agenda for today, which means this would be a very short meeting, but I have to imagine that there are folks who have things they would like to put onto the agenda and discuss.
Proposal.
Yes.
The last thing that was going on in terms of our proposals on the GitHub repository was the work that Keith was doing. So I was curious, Keith, if you might want to summarize that for us.
Yes, happily. Let me pull it up. I actually uh, shared this with the Kuba Agentic Networking group um, earlier today, and now gotten some good feedback that I need to go through and answer. So this is good. I will
And
also
Keith, I owe
go
you
ahead.
feedback as well, just to be clear.
Oh, awesome, cool. So, basically, and I should probably try to share so that people can follow along.
And it looks like Nir has his hand
And there is
raised.
his hand up.
Oh, Nir, go ahead.
Yeah, I have my hand up. Yeah, sorry for joining late. Just wanted to make sure that we clicked on the recording because we
We
have
are
set up the
recording.
recording to YouTube. So we have a new YouTube playlist.
We are indeed recording, and we have told everybody that they have to be nice because this is the CNCF.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
So,
Okay,
Keith,
lovely.
if you can share, go ahead. And if you cannot share, then sing out, and we'll make it so you can.
I cannot share, but I did just send a request.
All right, give it a shot.
There we go. All right, I'm going to show Firefox. Lovely. All right, so I put on the rich diff just so it's hopefully easier to see, and I will zoom in a bit again so it's hopefully easier to see.
You could also
But
just make the window narrower.
I've tried, and it's still how does that work?
That's way better. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Cool. So I took some of the work that Morgan did and some of the great work Morgan did to sort of flesh out the backend resource proposal and started adding some more sections on uh, specific designs for schema and open questions. Um, so one of the things that I did is added more stuff in the TLS section, made TLS configuration per port instead of for the entire backend, etc. Um, One of the things that piece of feedback that I got from Rob just a second ago actually was around backend TLS policy. He feels pretty strongly that this API should use backend TLS policy instead of Nline. Well, not instead of Nlining, but instead of creating a new policy or a new type in Go. Even if we just took backend TLS policy and inlined it here. He prefers policy as a separate CRD as well, so you can define it and reuse it. I feel fairly differently about this, um,
Yeah.
but I figured that this might be a good place to start discussion potentially. Flynn, sounds like you have thoughts. Go ahead.
I want to do some more reading before um, going too far down the rabbit hole of thoughts there. I think that the simplest way to put it is probably that my immediate reaction is that I'm thinking more along the line of you than along the line of Rob. But I need to do a little bit of reading and thinking to figure out to tease apart how much of that has to do with the definition of the resource and how much of that has to do with my biases around GEP 713.
Fair enough.
Do we
Uh,
have, and this will not surprise you, but how far down the rabbit hole of the user stories have we gone in this particular case?
Not very far, but that is a fantastic framing that I think we should
Yeah,
keep. Um, because
there's,
go ahead.
I might be about to say what you were about to say. There are a lot of things about this where the right answer is going to depend on who we think has to mess with TLS policy.
100% yes.
Yeah,
I would
I go
to
ahead. I
go
thought you were
to
done.
go just a little bit down that route. I would kind of like it to be the case that it is possible to be a developer of an MCP server or an agent or a model or something like that and not have to think about the details beyond, oh, yeah, I want TLS. I think that there are scenarios where handing that bit of, defining what the policy is, being able to hand that off in a lot of cases is going to be good, I think. But I'm I think we should think about that and talk about it because that may or may not be true in among people who are actually doing this kind of work.
Yes, I agree a lot with that, which I think also informs some of my leanings. So, like, I think I think the world changes when you stop talking about Kubernetes services and start talking about
Hmm.
uh, going to an external FQDN because I think the persona actually changes a bit. And I think this is actually gonna. I know I just started with the TLS thing, but I think this section on scope and persona ownership for the backend resource.
Yeah.
Um, when you and I talked about this a little bit, um, but TLDR here, who owns backends? Um, because I've talked I worked in the context of Istio with users who have that role sort of straddled between um, cluster admins and app developers. And so the cluster admin says, oh, we have all these services that call out to S3 buckets. And so I want to have sort of one backend declaration for how all of my services talk to every S3 bucket that describes the certificate we're going to use, that describes the extensions and filters we're going to use. I've got a credential injector for talking to S3 that my platform team owns, and that is sort of there for the entire cluster to take advantage of.
Right.
But that's one common scenario. But you've got other ones where you've got a service. Let's say it is um, the core API for the system, but my and so it talks to a database. But that's the only database that is that's the only application that talks to the database. Should the cluster admin, who's not a DBA, know how to go and configure talking to that backend? Um, should that cluster admin know the right, define the extensions for talking to that backend, et cetera? Maybe the app developer should own that. Maybe for the app developer who is calling out to Wikipedia or any sort of hydration service, like an analytics service, is another good example. Um, should the platform admin have to get their hands dirty, or should the organization be blocked from moving forward until the platform admin blesses it? Or what if it's a tenancy model where different tenants have different views of the world for how they talk to services? Um, and then in that world, what happens when tenants conflict? How does a gateway with different backends and different namespaces resolve things? So there's a lot of complexities to this. Uh, think I've gone through most of the high level questions that I've gone through that I've written down, but I'd love to hear if anybody else has other um, user stories or scenarios that can help maybe inform some of the discussion.
It's worth pointing out also that in some of those cases, we have historically addressed them by separating personas and roles, and separating personas and people, and acknowledging that in a small organization you might have a single person fulfilling multiple roles, and in a larger organization those roles might be separate people. I also think it's entertaining to think about the scenarios that Keith is mentioning there, where in what ways do those change, if at all, if the backend is not in the cluster versus is in the cluster? I'm not, I mean, there are a lot of cases where I actually think it doesn't matter where the backend is. And um, other than the obvious, the mechanical aspect of how do you talk about it, right? But Keith, to your question about, oh, I've got this thing injecting S3 credentials all over the place, that doesn't change whether you're literally talking to Amazon S3 or whether you're talking to something in your cluster that happens to use the S3 object protocol. Or maybe I should say it doesn't have to change.
It doesn't have to change, but I think the difference with like Kubernetes services is that you have a sort of a single owner of the service in the cluster
Oh, do you?
who's
Because, I mean, I don't know. There are certainly cases that we know of where there are people inside a cluster who are using something within the cluster that is owned by a group that's totally separate and is unwilling to talk to them about anything.
oh, I don't disagree. I think what I'm saying is that like the use of that FQDN, the use of that DNS name for a given
Yeah.
service has an owner. Like somebody deployed that service. We can point to
Fair.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
For external services or external FQDNs, the owner is not, even if you assuming we can't talk to, even if you don't talk to people who own the in cluster version, that still exists. It's a singleton. When it comes to external services, there might not be like that can be again two completely separate tenants who have oh my goodness, Mac OS, why my other fireworks. Now those could be two completely separate tenants with two completely separate access policies who are interacting with that external service in two completely different ways. Oh goodness, everything okay, Flynn?
Sorry, what?
There is some audio. Uh,
Oh.
Raccoon broke
okay.
to his hamster.
I did not hear that, so we'll just assume that it's okay.
I have a question, if I may interject. So one thing that I've been thinking about with backends is the fact that one of the main patterns that it seems backend is going to replace, and you can tell me here, you have more experience than I do, is the synthetic service approach to egress, where you model your egress via a service, which is not really a service in your cluster. It's representing some external backend. And already people will configure a backend TLS policy today for those synthetic services, I'm supposing. And so maybe we could get some clarity by seeing how satisfactory that is. What's the pain point for egress today using a synthetic service? Because we want to, in my model of things, backend is going to replace that synthetic service approach. That's one of the things it will do. And so if we just remove service and slot backend on top of it and say, okay, we'll figure out some way to attach a backend TLS policy here and it'll work roughly the same way. What are the things that are currently painful for folks trying to do egress today that would continue to be painful for them? And what could we solve for them if we allowed some sort of inlined approach instead of this policy.
So the synthetic service approach is that using external name services?
Yes, I believe so. It's looking at the state of the world. It's one of the ways that egress is being modeled right now, where you have a service which is actually like just an FQD and what we're trying to do with the back end.
I think similar to the S3 example you were talking about earlier, Keith, like that might be one example of kind of Morgan's describing.
I guess I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out if we have inline TLS policy, that can be useful for application developers because they can specify policy, for their application they're developing. But that's not the way things are today. Is there a real need for something like that today?
So my bias, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I should have read up on this, but my sort of assumption when it comes to external name services is that they're just fundamentally insecure. Um, and I promise I've got reasons for this, but I can't call them off the top of my head. Off the top of my head, we've seen several issues with this in Istio, um, and
Didn't that have something to do with the fact
black
that
holes.
didn't it have something to do with the fact that if you're it ends up arranging it so that it well, sorry, let me back up. If I remember right, external service is literally just a very thin veneer over a DNS lookup. So it gives you the impression of something that's in the cluster that you should trust, but in reality, it's completely under the control of whoever happens to own the DNS outside the cluster. Is that where you were coming from, Keith? That I think that's what I remember people complaining about with external service a lot.
Yeah, like you can, oh yeah, that's what I think that's part of it, or you could create an external name for a internal service
Yeah.
and sort of do a host name hijacking sort of thing without, like, you can be a service in a completely different namespace and take over a service that exists in an admin namespace, for example. So this is demonstrating I haven't thought about external service a ton, but it is certainly a way people have modeled it. Um, I think the other challenging thing from an admin perspective, and I've got this question somewhere in like the comments, um, but essentially the idea is, how can I essentially control access to this thing? Because ideally, what I want to do is I want to shut off all external egress and and ensure that all traffic goes through my policy enforcement point, my egress gateway. Um, and I guess, in theory, um, you can still get there with the external name because you would create sort of one canonical service. Um,
Mm.
maybe?
I feel
No,
like we're back.
maybe
I feel
not.
like we're back to the. I feel like we're back to the idea that trying to create a service that covers the entire internet that's not your cluster is really hard. All right, that's fundamentally not a service in Kubernetes speak. That in my mind that should be something else. I'm obviously biased. Let's be clear.
No, I don't, and I'm not saying we should encourage that way of thinking. I'm just trying to think about what exists today,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the advantage of an inline, and Mike was saying this in the chat. There's a lot of advantages to inlining TLS policy. It's really obvious
Yes.
what the policy is. It's easy for the application developer to configure, and I
Well,
wonder why you couldn't have uh, an inline policy, but then also we could support a more global policy. Maybe that's too complicated because then there's a precedence.
okay.
You
So
have some ways. Oh, sorry.
this is a thing that comes up a lot in Gateway API, and I would kind of like to try to separate the mechanics of how we talk about TLS policy from acknowledging the need to talk about TLS policy, because the mechanics of how we talk about TLS policy, we can spend a week arguing about that. And Mike and Keith and I kind of have, and it wasn't much fun. So um, there are a lot of ways where I think, Morgan, your question about what does it look like if we try to use a backend instead of a synthetic service, that to me is um, honestly much more interesting right this particular second. And the reason I think it's interesting is that um, it kind of does give you a way to talk about something that has an external name while still having a place that you can associate policy or you can use as a known internal target and things like that, right? Because I have not talked about this with Keith, but I would expect a backend to have a cluster IP, for example. And then a lot of interesting things come out of that. Keith has just kind of had a sort of a shocked expression. So maybe that's not what he's thinking about. And that would also be interesting. But you're defining an explicit rendezvous point in the cluster that might have the ability to then explicitly target something outside the cluster. That to me is very powerful. That's one of the things I like about the backend resource idea.
So I'm gonna zoom out like 10x, and so I did this in the agentic networking group and didn't do this here, and I probably should have. But I want to just sort of talk about how I'm viewing the backend resource from a roles perspective. So like 3 years ago in Gateway API, when we were first doing Gamma and talking about mesh, we discussed the backend and front end role of a service
Holy
and how
crap,
it's.
was that really 3 years ago?
I think so. Yeah, 2022, because that's when I started working on Gateway API.
Oh my
Um,
God.
yeah, so we discussed this. And there's a link somewhere that I can share, or maybe have it shared in the doc somewhere. When it
We
talks about how
discussed it a
service,
lot.
yes,
Find it.
over many, many,
I have it before.
many links, many weeks. But the idea is that service has both a front end and back end role. Service's front end role is it's a thing I can address in my cluster and send traffic to. So as a client, I either through IP address, practically, there's a DNS lookup there, but from a wire perspective, I'm sitting to an IP address, and this is sort of my way of expressing my intent of go to this
Right.
virtual thing. Then there's the backend role in which the service acts as a bag of endpoints to load balance across. Um, and service serves both of those roles at the same time. And so in Gateway API, when we sort of made the decision that when you're doing have service as a parent ref, you're specifically referring to the front end role of the service. And when you're doing service as a back end ref, you're exclusively referring to the back end role of the service. This was very important so that when you couldn't create, for example, infinite loops where an HTTP route is linked to a service that then goes to a backend as a service, and then the HTTP route applies again over and over and over again.
And
Um,
there are ways in which that decision is limiting and can be very counterintuitive and confusing to people. But the circular routing thing that Keith is talking about, we all decided was far, far, far worse than that.
yep, absolutely. And so the way I view the backend resource is firmly in that backend role, is sort of the perspective I have in the design. I talked to the Kubernetes folks and mentioned that this is actually a way in which I think we're missing something, maybe in the egress story, potentially. But that might be scoped more for mesh. Because in mesh role, we sometimes have resources that have both a front end and back end role. But the reason that I wouldn't be for cluster IP, like back end and a cluster IP, is because in my mind, it shouldn't need one because back end is serving the back end role. And therefore, and in the gateway API north-south case, the gateway is the front end, and in every situation, backend is acting as just a bag of endpoints or bag of hosts or bag of destinations,
Yeah, we should
and
probably
you do
talk more about that. I mean, sorry, maybe not in this meeting, right?
sure.
But
But to be clear, I think there are definitely scenarios where you
mhm.
need to refer to an external FQDN as a front end and do some routing things there. But this proposal is because this proposal is called egress gateways, I am sort of saying, hey, the gateway is acting as the front end. And therefore, and there's a comment somewhere I should try to find at some point. But the gateway is acting as the front end in this case, and there might be meshes or other things that have implementation specific ways of getting traffic to that gateway. Like Istio Ambit would have like a waypoint, or the mesh would know there's a gateway there. You refer to a different subset in Istio to sort of go to for the client to know to go to the gateway instead. But from a proposal perspective, I'm thinking of back into slotting specifically in that back end role.
And in the proposal, I specifically made a note that in the proposal as it is now, we expect traffic to be routed to the gateway. Um,
Oh,
so
yes, right
that the
here.
back end can just use the gateway as the front end.
Yeah, I was just realizing as I was listening to this and thinking about it that I was scoping outward for some other things with backend and not necessarily thinking about it only in the context of egress gateways. Um,
I think we're on the
but
same
most of
page
those
about some of those
things,
other things. I,
yeah,
I, I think
most
I
of
think
those
we're
things have nothing to do with this particular discussion. So probably that would be better to take offline. Um,
yeah, and I think there's a lot about the egress story generally where that will be useful. Maybe we can need to figure out how to bind an IP address to a backend and have that IP address act as the front end versus
yeah.
there are things we can do. But I'm trying to keep this really small, just particularly because we're only talking about the back end role, and there's already a lot of stuff to discuss and hammer out.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
so okay, where else did I want to go?
So
Oh,
here's a fun question for you, Keith.
okay.
Um, does that imply that in this proposal you are explicitly only thinking of backends referring to things outside the cluster?
No.
Yeah, that's what I
Good
was
question.
thinking.
Good question. So we've got a type. Yeah, there's a destination type field. I think we
Yep.
should have type FQDN, type Kubernetes service, etc. Um, uh, type IP, IP address, even if you just need to talk to an arbitrary IP. Um, I do think that there is or maybe a set of IPs. I have to think about that more. But I do think that the Kubernetes service type has some issues with like backend TLS policy versus the inline policy, and we don't want to create a mismatch there. So I need to figure out some degree of harmony for that. But the reason for including for me having that sort of, I think Morgan actually had this type in there too. I think the reason why we want this to be for different types is because a lot of the stuff that we're doing is motivated by AI use cases and LLM inferencing and MCP, and like your LLM might not be off your cluster. You could be
Yeah.
running a llama model. Goodness, that's hard to say. You could have a llama model internally. You could have a private instance of what have you running inside your cluster. Um, oh yeah, inference pool supports, or you might have an MCP proxy that is inside, or not proxy, an MCP server running inside your cluster that you want to talk to internally, and have the gateway actually decide whether to send internal versus external. So I think having the stuff that we're trying to get inside of backend is available to services as well is going to be important. Near, go ahead. You've got a hand up.
Yeah. So I'll start with the end point that before like asking my questions, I'll start with the point that I haven't reviewed the PR yet, so maybe I'm missing things that are covered. Just didn't got the time yet. You just said that. So I initially thought the backend resource your intention was like external backends only, but now I understand you consider also the in cluster backends. So now the next question is, do you think like not now, maybe like I don't know, 2 years ahead? Do you think a backend can be like the version 2 evolution of like replacing service in HTTP route, like directing traffic from HTTP route to a backend, and a backend can represent a service,
I think
and
this
then
is the
we
point
can,
where we're supposed to scream and all jump off the call.
oh yeah. No, I'm just trying
I
to
think
understand the
I also
intention
think it's
because
I also think it's safe to say that anytime you're talking to anybody who has been working in any way with Gateway API, we all have the ulterior motive of decomposing service. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a great question, Near. And sorry, Phil, I thought you were done.
yeah,
Sorry to cut
I
you
am
off.
done. I am done. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Um, but yeah, so it's not an explicit goal, and I did not write this with that understanding. It sort of follows from that understanding of the different roles of service, and trying to write an API that is targeting just one of those roles. Like Flynn was saying, those of us who've been in Gateway API for a bit, you start seeing how like that you have to do these things. You have to decompose the roles to make a sensible API, or you create the loops. And so when you do that, you start seeing, oh, wait, this could be a path like away from service. And you're seeing this pop up in different Gateway API contexts because service is effectively frozen. And so now you're seeing different groups start talking about this model of a decorating service or creating all like back in TLS policy, in my opinion. The main reason back in TLS policy exists is because there's no way of adding new fields to service practically.
yeah,
Like it,
I
like
agree.
you can totally imagine that TLS setting could just be a field on service and people would read that, but that's not possible. So we have policy attachment. If we could start from scratch, I think that having TLS in the API just makes sense. And
In a
while we
lot of
don't
ways,
want,
yeah.
yeah, and so while we don't want to drift, I think this is probably the better user experience altogether for the user. Um, and so, yeah, no concrete goals to necessarily like replace service in any short period of time. But for Gateway API specifically, assuming this gets pretty widespread, I think it would be very nice to just
Interesting.
remove some of that ambiguity. Service as parent ref, and then have backends with decorated policy and extensions and things in the API.
I think it's
Yeah, I
also
mean,
worth noting that it's not just the front end and back end roles. If you spend any time with Gateway API and you spend any time trying to actually design APIs describing how traffic moves in a Kubernetes cluster, there's like 5 different things that service does, none of which can be separated from service, many of which you don't want in every context. And it gets really ugly really fast. Like, service is effectively the only API that we have for allocating DNS names in a cluster. That's stupid.
Absolutely
It
another thing that I
causes
would love to
it
break apart.
causes yeah, it causes a lot of problems if you start trying to design APIs around the motion of traffic in a Kubernetes cluster. Service is also effectively our only entry into allocating IP addresses and things like that. And it is a nightmare. It is truly a nightmare. So this is why we all end up looking over and going like, hey, we don't really have a choice but to start trying to tackle this problem. Um, None of us particularly want to tackle this problem. We just don't see any other way, is all. Yeah, the whole reason inference pool is a thing is because they didn't want it to have a DNS name. Right.
That's why they pay us the big bucks.
Or something like that.
Yeah, it's something like that.
One of the other really fun, terrifying things was a conversation happening in the API Machinery channel not too long ago, and I don't even remember exactly what the topic was. What I remember was that the upshot of that conversation was realizing that there are areas in which the core Kubernetes maintainers want to extend service, and they cannot figure out how, which is the sort of thing you look at and you go, oh dear, right? Like, it's the same sort of feeling as when I was talking to my high school calculus teacher years ago and found out that, oh, how do you do this integral? And my teacher's like, I don't know. I taught you everything I know. If you don't know how to do it, what makes you think I can do it? But you're the teacher. You're supposed to know all this stuff, Yeah, it was deeply depressing.
So to recap, it seems like where we're landing is maybe backend in the Gateway API is our chance to do things right in a way that's not going to meaningfully interfere with the rest of the Kubernetes API. And so this is a good philosophy to go forward with then. And so earlier I was framing it as, what are people doing today? Why is it painful? Which was not the right framing. I think this framing of, we have a chance here to do something new, which is separate enough from the rest of the API that we can fix some of these problems, is a nice framing, and it supporting inline is what I'm getting out of this.
Yeah, I mean, understanding what people are doing today, I think, is very useful framing as well to understand sort of if people, because again, we could build this and nobody ever adopts it if it's too onerous to use. So I think that's very valuable to still keep in our minds. I think on inlining specifically, that's still where my preference lies, but I understand Rob's arguments about a drift between backend TLS policy um, versus what's inline here. Ideally, I think we probably I think in the perfect world they look the exact same, but there are things that don't always make sense in Kubernetes world that would probably do make sense for external. Like, for example, the default posture for TLS in Kubernetes, it's accepted that there's no TLS by default. That's why meshes are a thing, and among other things, VNet encryption, etc. When talking to an external service, I feel somewhat strongly that we should default to making TLS like on by default. And if you're opting out of TLS, you have to explicitly say so, which is why I've got this insecure disable field. Again, is a personal island. I've seen nobody else do this, but this is sort of, I think we can do better if we have, I know this sort of goes against my idea for it, but like I think Cell would allow us to have different defaults for TLS if it's inline versus having to do it back in TLS policy requires because it's a policy for services.
I was pretty much with you until you said Cell, and now I'm kind of terrified.
Validation, and replace Cell with validation. Like validation can allow you to sort of do some of those things.
But the overall point that you're making is that the posture for egress and the posture for in-cluster, I would tend to agree that those should not be the same by default. The world is TLS everywhere. We should lean into that rather than not. Maybe it makes sense that you default to doing TLS but not providing a client cert, and maybe that's a fine way to do things. Sorry, I've had certificates on the brain for a little while because they're so horrible in so many different ways. So it's natural for me to think about that and to start wondering things about what should the default be for whether or not you verify the server certificate of the thing you're talking to. I don't know, but defaulting to do TLS seems like a really good idea as soon as we're talking about egress to me. I think that there is 100% a significant question around the user stories for TLS policy and the roles and personas using them. I think those are going to drive how I feel about allowing inline versus allowing some form of global versus not allowing inline and requiring it all to be global. But my knee-jerk reaction is that requiring that you not inline things is silly. So once again, we're back to Flynn saying, where are the user stories? And I'm sure that nobody is shocked by that.
Yeah, we've got a lot as far as how people want to use it, and I think that these do help guide a lot of these things. So, for example, as a
Yeah,
gateway admin providing egress to external services, I need to be able
yeah,
to manage CAs and pin certificates or custom CAs and also CRLs for talking to those what's it called to those external services. And I think that's a thing where like sure the app dev can do that.
but they shouldn't
Does
have
the
to.
app is they shouldn't have to, and are they going to be bothered to in a lot of cases? Um, Probably not.
Yeah.
So
And you have a thing there
yeah,
about fine-tuning DNS, DNS resolution and things like that. Um, what level of fine-tuning do we think we need for certificate handling, for example? Or like, do we think the cluster admin? I'm going to go ahead and phrase this as a question, even though I think it's kind of silly to phrase it as a question. Do we think that the cluster admin is going to be happy with, oh, all of these egress connections have the same configuration for whether we validate CA certs coming in or not? Or do we think that they need to be able to configure that per workload or per external target or things like that, right? Um, Questions like that are going to be interesting. But there's one huge thing here which is very, very different from the rest of Gateway API, which is that we are defining a resource that we own. We are not talking about how do we attach policy to service anymore. And that, I think, has a huge impact on how we should design this stuff.
Can you folks still hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I just switched audio devices. So I think concretely, as we're starting to wrap up on the call, it sounds like folks just need to take a look through the proposal and think through some of these things. Just to reiterate, I would say some of the big open questions are around inline TLS versus backend TLS policy, scope and persona ownership. So my current position is I think we probably, I hate it, but this is what I've concluded. I think we need two resources. I think we need two resources for two different personas. One is for admins. One is for app developers, and I think that's going to allow for better semantics, especially in how we deal with conflicts. But that is just sort of my current posture that I am sure will change probably 3 or 4 times throughout this process. And the other open question I'd love to get more feedback on, where is it? Oh, I didn't have a text section on it, but it is here. So the idea of backend protocol options. So the idea with this, the Agentic Working Group has MCP backend sort of as a top-level field, as a type of backend. I have it in this proposal as being a protocol on a port for a backend destination. And within the different protocols, we can have different options for it. TLS is specialist, we've got that at the top level, but you can imagine if people have support for MCP, or you could set different MCP protocol options for version, path, etc. I imagine a future, or not imagine, there will be a future proposal for LLM consumption. In fact, maybe we need to be working on that in parallel because it's one of the core AI gateway use cases for calling out to OpenAI, Anthropic, Vertex, whatever. So I think that would be another protocol. I think that'll be another protocol, and then maybe there'll be like LLM protocol options for specifying chat completions API and translating between Mistral, all the different LLM providers. Depending on what your implementation supports, you can have different options there. Having support for maybe some opaque struct of some sort. So that is where I sort of land. I'd love to hear if anybody has concerns with that approach in the period, not to be now. Any last things on this proposal before we call it?
I don't think so. Definitely some things we get to think about.
Cool.
I don't think I
Anything else that you want to discuss? I'll stop sharing at this point.
don't think I fully understood the two resources direction, but that's maybe more than I can fit in my head right now.
Yeah, fair. I think part of it is just I wanted to put the idea out there for my biases working on STO, where it's not. That's more on the front end side, but even from a back end perspective, the idea of who controls how we access this back end resource, and maybe that's an argument for having it all be cluster scoped, and having the mesh admin own it, and maybe that's fine to start off with.
Because we know how much people love cluster scoped resources.
I think cluster scope's a non-starter for some use cases.
I have that same. That's sort of how I got to where I am, because I feel like there are use cases where they're both non-starters. Like I imagine a admin saying, "I want to be able to control all of the access to S3 centrally, and I want people to be able to create a route going to S3
Okay.
without me knowing about it."
Yeah, I get what you're saying, where
It's-
like you want some kind of cluster-wide policy as like the last stop for FQDN type stuff before it leaves the cluster, and that is something that a cluster operator controls. But
And I mean, there are ways you can do that without cluster scoped resources. It's not clear to me that they're better than cluster scoped resources, but there are ways you can do it without that. But I don't know. I think we need to dig in a little bit more and talk to some other folks and see what they think.
cool. Thanks, y'all. Good discussion today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Nir, do you want to toss a link? Do you have the name of the YouTube channel, or want to toss a link to the
Yeah,
YouTube channel in the agenda?
yeah, sure. Actually, I already did. I think it should be at the upper
Oh, yeah.
part of the document. So it's
think I
actually
just
a
found it.
playlist. The channel is Kubernetes official channel, and we have a new playlist. And if we clicked on recording at the beginning of this meeting, we should be able to see the recording probably in a few hours. So let's check it. Maybe tomorrow. But I do
Sounds
want to
good.
raise one minor point, which
Mhm.
I'm sure at least few more people had that point in mind. I feel like the setup of the meetings is not so great. Like we have two options in a week. The earlier option is mainly for Europe time zone, but we don't have that much of people joining. And then on the other hand, the intention of the later option, the US time zone, was to be able to allow the chairs from this time zone to be able to join, but then some things moved, and there were some shuffling with the meetings, and now I think Shane has some conflicts, and as you can see, not all chairs of this working group can join, at least not consistently. So I think we might need to reconsider the time of the meetings, just putting this on the table. Of course, not no intention to decide now, but just like to raise this topic. If everyone is fine with current meetings, yeah, let's continue. But if others are thinking the same, maybe we should do like voting and choose a new time, and then do like just one meeting a week with no different 2 time zones, where we can meet once a week and drive things quicker.
The proposed time for the new.
Not yet. I think I don't want to propose something that aligns with my schedule, so I'll first coordinate with the other working group chairs. We'll choose like, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 time slots, and then we might do like voting in the Slack channel and see which of the options is the best for everyone. But this is assuming the other chairs are everybody are on the same page with this. Flynn, what do you think?
I mean, generally, this time is going to work out okay for me, and the
Yeah,
earlier
for
one,
me too.
yeah,
I'm just like,
and
I'd
the
like to see
earlier one,
Shane here as well.
yeah. I cannot speak to Shane's schedule in general, although I know that he happens to be traveling for a couple of weeks. Um, I'm certainly not averse to checking in Slack to see if there's, see if people's schedules have changed and would be helpful to change this one. Um,
For what it's worth, right now I'm trying to span all of the meetings that happen on Thursdays, and this time slot actually does fit in.
it's the only
There's like
one.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, okay,
there's
so
Epic
maybe that
Network in
was
the morning, then
only.
Sync Network, then Inference Extension, then this.
Yeah. So
I
maybe
actually
it
was
is
trying to make
only.
Signet. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's only the my feeling because of the meetings on Monday in the Europe time zone. Maybe we should just, um, you know, consolidate on this time and do like once a week. Maybe that would be better. Like keep it only Thursdays in this time. Keep the same time, but once a week without the Europe time zone, which we don't have much attendees anyway.
I mean, obviously, I'd be okay with that because I can't make the Europe time anyway.
Yeah,
But
I
I
mean,
can get the EU time. I just didn't realize that meeting existed before this week.
okay. So
Yeah, it's like 8 a.m. US East Coast. So like for those of us on the East Coast, like it's doable.
you mean for those of us on the East Coast who don't have children?
Sure, yes.
Yeah. Um,
okay, let's take it offline on the leads channel and see if we need to make a change.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Thanks
Neil.
everyone.
All right. Thanks much. Talk to you all in a bit.
There you go.